Hello students, sorry about that. The program I use to record these video lectures seems to have had some kind of a glitch, so this is going to be a two-parter. As I was saying, the rebellion started by Chief Opochenko in 1622 almost succeeded in wiping out the Virginia colony, and it would have succeeded had it not been for an Indian, a Christian Indian, who alerted the colony's leaders that the attack was coming. And so, thanks to him, we don't even know his name. The documents just refer to him as an Indian belonging to Perry, so he was probably an Indian slave who had become a Christian. But in any case, he saved the colony, and after the rebellion, the Virginia settlers felt incredibly betrayed. They felt that the Indians had stabbed them in the back. They really resented the sneaky and underhanded way the attack was carried out as they saw it. And so they really felt like all bets were off after the rebellion, that they could do whatever they wanted to the Indians, take as much of their land as they wanted without paying for it. And in a document written by one of the Virginia Company officials, Edward Waterhouse, after the attack, Waterhouse even went so far as to say that the settlers could now make the Indians into slaves if they wanted to do that. And so really you could say that Opochenko's rebellion put an end to the promise of peace that Pocahontas' marriage to John Rolfe had brought. And from that point forward, really the relationships between the English and the Indians in Virginia were pretty bad. That was often the story in the English colonies. The settlers would start off with good intentions towards the Indians, and then over time things would go sour. The English really had the worst relationship with the Indians of any of the colonial powers. Spain, France, the Netherlands. The English relationships with the Indians always seemed to go bad, and that was certainly the case here, as the English settlers continued to push the Indians farther westward towards the Appalachian Mountains and to take their land. And in 1618, the Virginia Company had actually gotten a new charter, which really provided an incentive to take more and more of the Indians' land, because the charter said that anyone who brought a new settler over to Virginia to work in the colony would get 50 acres of free land from the company. And where was this land going to come from? Why, from the Indians, of course. And so the new charter of 1618 really almost guaranteed that the Indians would continue to lose most of their land and be pushed farther and farther to the west. And I'll come back to this slide, but I want to show you on the map here how the English settlements spread westward along the James River. More and more large tobacco plantations were established up and down the river. I especially want to point out on the map, if you look down to the east, that is to the right and slightly south of Jamestown, you'll see a plantation called Martin's Hundred. And the author that you're going to be reading to answer your reading questions this week, Richard Freethorn, was an Englishman, a young Englishman who came to Virginia as an indentured servant to work on this tobacco plantation at Martin's Hundred. We'll talk in a few minutes about what an indentured servant was. But in any case, Freethorn wrote a letter back to his parents, which you're going to read, talking about the terrible living conditions in colonial Virginia for these white indentured servants. The lack of food, the hard work, the disease, the crime, and so forth. And it's a very poignant letter. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. His spelling is very unconventional. You may have to read it out loud in order to get the meaning more clearly. So if you have trouble with this, try reading it out loud. That may actually help. But in any case, it's interesting that Richard Freethorn, like so many of the early settlers of Virginia did not survive his Virginia experience. We know that shortly after he mailed that letter to his parents, Freethorn died of a disease and was buried there at Martin's Hundred. Back to this slide, I just want to mention briefly one other important development. In the history of the Virginia Company, there had been allegations of corruption and some scandals about the leadership of the Virginia Company, and by 1624 King James was fed up and decided to abolish the company and to take over the colony of Virginia himself. And this really set a trend in colonial American history, because several of the colonies, which were started out in some other form, like by a business corporation or by proprietors, eventually became royal colonies that were ruled over by the English government, and Virginia was the first to go that route in 1624. All right, so back to the issue of labor and the question of where were the settlers going to find laborers to work the tobacco crop. We know that there were African Americans in Virginia as early as 1619. We know that from an entry in John Rolfe's diary, where he said that one day in 1619 a Dutch ship pulled up next in the river next to Jamestown and unloaded what he called, quote, 20 and odd Negroes, end quote, who were then sold to local plantation owners as laborers. However, it's very interesting that they were not sold as slaves, but as indentured servants, because really slavery was not part of the plan in the Virginia colony from the beginning. The leaders of the colony believed that they could find enough laborers to work the crops by recruiting white indentured servants, mainly from England and Scotland. Now, what was an indentured servant? An indentured servant was a person who agreed to come over to the colony and to give usually between 4 and 7 years of their life working on a plantation in Virginia. In return, the plantation owner would pay for their passage on the ship over to Virginia. Now, that may not seem like a very great deal for the indentured servant, but you have to understand there were a lot of desperately poor people in England at this time who were suffering from inflation and other social problems. Many of them were homeless, vagrants, desperately in search of work. Many of them ended up on the streets of London. And for those people who were really struggling to survive, this was actually a good prospect, that if they went to Virginia, and if they survived their period of indentured servitude, they could eventually start a new and better life. Because if you lived through your term as a servant, when it expired, you would be set free, and normally the landowner would give you some land. Sometimes they would just give cash or other gifts, but normally the landowner would give you some land to, that you could set yourself up on as an independent farmer. And so it was worth the risk for many people who came over to colonial Virginia as indentured servants. In fact, out of all the white immigrants to the Chesapeake Bay area, about 3/4, 75% of them were originally indentured servants. Only about 25% of the indentured servants, however, 1/4, were women. And that created problems in colonial Virginia, because when you have a society like that, that's overwhelmingly male, there are always issues. So, for example, the men would compete over the few women who were there. It was very hard for a male in colonial Virginia to find a wife to settle down to raise a family. And when that is the case, you always have a society that's more violent, more unstable, where life expectancy is lower. And that was certainly the case in colonial Virginia, a very difficult place to live. But again, it's very interesting. I said slavery was not in the original plan. that even the first African Americans who came to the colony were not slaves, were in fact indentured servants. And as far as we can tell from the records, it seems as if the white indentured servants and the black indentured servants early in Virginia history were not treated very differently. I mean, life for an indentured servant was very hard. It was hard work, and the master could punish you. He could whip you or withhold food from you or so forth. But it seems like that ill treatment was meted out to the white and the black indentured servants more or less equally. And furthermore, if you were an African American indentured servant and you survived your period of servitude, you would become a free man, and you might get land in the colony. And there were even examples of free blacks in colonial Virginia who became landowners and even acquired indentured servants and slaves of their own to help them work the land. One such individual was Anthony Johnson. And in the video that you're going to watch, part of a documentary video called Africans in America, The Terrible Transformation, you'll learn more about the life of Anthony Johnson. His life really indicates that in the early 17th century in Virginia, the brutal slave system that would later develop had not yet taken root, that there were actually still some opportunities for African Americans in the colony, and that the relationships between the races were a little more fluid, less hostile than they would later become. And that tells us that the really brutal and evil slave system that did develop in Virginia and throughout the South was not a foregone conclusion. It really wasn't part of the original plan. It was something that developed over decades because of people's bad choices, because of their greed, and especially because of this overwhelming need for labor to grow the tobacco crop. But it was not a foregone conclusion. It was something that developed gradually over time. Let's turn to a neighboring colony to Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay region, Maryland. How did Maryland get its start? Well, first I'll mention that King James I died in the year 1625, and the next king was James's oldest son, Charles, who became King Charles I of England. Charles had a close friend whose name was George Calvert. Calvert was a very influential politician in England. He was a member of the King's Privy Council, kind of like the President's Cabinet in America today. But George Calvert had a secret. He was a Roman Catholic in terms of religion. And ever since the Protestant Reformation had happened in England, Catholics had been treated very poorly in England. In the same way that Protestants were treated poorly in Catholic countries at that time. So if you were Catholic in England, you had to pay higher taxes. You were not allowed to go to the university or to serve in the armed forces. There were many jobs and opportunities that were closed off to you. And so when Calvert came out of the closet, if you will, and revealed that he was a Catholic, that meant that he had to resign his government positions. But Charles was very sorry to see him go. He really liked and respected Calvert. And in fact, Charles showed that by making Calvert a lord, giving him a title of nobility. So George Calvert became the first Lord Baltimore. And Lord Baltimore went to Charles in 1632 and requested permission to start a new colony in America where his fellow Catholics could find a place to practice their religion in peace. And this new colony was to be called Maryland. Well, Charles agreed to that, and so Lord Baltimore became the proprietor of this new colony, Maryland, and of course it's no accident that the largest city in Maryland today is named after Lord Baltimore, Maryland. So this was another type of colony. This is what we call a proprietary colony that was ruled over by a proprietor, Lord Baltimore, who basically owned all the land in the colony and could do whatever he wanted with it. Lord Baltimore, like I said, had started the colony as a place for Catholics, a refuge for Catholics to find peace, to worship God in their own way. But Lord Baltimore was a very broad-minded individual, and he also invited many Protestants to come over to his colony. And partly that was just for practical reasons, because he needed laborers to work the tobacco fields in Maryland, and so he allowed Protestants to come as well. That caused problems, because in those days, people really did not tolerate members of other religions the way they do today. We're all told today we need to just get along and accept people who have religious beliefs different from ours, coexist with them. But really, that idea of religious tolerance did not exist in the early 17th century. In Europe, people took religion very seriously. For them, it was a matter of life and death. They believed that the members of their own religious group were going to heaven, and that the members of all the other religious groups were going to hell. And so for them, they really did not believe in toleration. And when the Catholics and the Protestant settlers came to Maryland, there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of trash talk, there was a lot of hostility between them. And that led the Maryland colonial legislature to pass a really landmark law in 1649 called the Act of Toleration. Now, I want to mention every colony, every English colony in the New World had its own legislature, which was elected by the people in the colony. And that became a very important tradition in the English colonies that bolstered the colonists' sense of self-government. But in any case, the Maryland legislature in 1649 passed the Act of Toleration. And this was basically the first law in human history that tried to get members of different religious groups to just get along with each other. For example, the Act of Toleration forbade anyone in the colony from calling anyone else names based on their religious preference. So basically, the Act of Toleration was just trying to get the colonists to play nice with each other, respect and accept members of other religions, and not attack them or treat them with hostility or hatred. And in a way, the Maryland colonial legislature really did strike almost the very first blow in human history for the concept of religious tolerance, or at least in European American history, you could say. And that happened right here in the future United States. All right, last slide for this lecture. So, both Virginia and Maryland were very successful with their cash crop tobacco. Both colonies continued to expand, so that by the early 1670s, the Indians had been pushed back into the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, mostly in the western parts of Virginia and Maryland. There was a tribe in western Maryland called the Susquehannocks, who decided to leave Maryland and move south into western Virginia. And when they got there, they came into conflict with poor, mostly white frontier settlers in western Virginia, who were hungry for Indian land, who really didn't want any more Indians to come and settle there. And so the frontiersmen and the Susquehannock Indians came into conflict. There was some fighting. The frontier settlers felt that the government of Virginia was not doing enough to protect them from these Indians. They accused the governor, Governor Barclay, of ignoring their pleas for help because he was making money trading with those Indians. And so the governor, they said, refused to listen to them, refused to protect their families. And these grievances basically became the basis of a revolutionary movement in Virginia that was led by a man named Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Bacon was not a poor white frontier settler. He was actually a rich planter who was a member of the House of Burgesses, which was Virginia's colonial legislature. So he was a very prominent individual in the colony, but seeing perhaps an opportunity to get power for himself, he took up the cause of these frontier people, became their leader, and in 1676 actually led them in a rebellion which was very successful at first. The rebels captured the city of Jamestown, burnt it to the ground, and chased the governor out of the colony and took over the government of Virginia for a time. But then Bacon himself became ill of an illness and died in 1676, and without his leadership, the rebel movement really quickly disappeared and petered out. The governor was able to come back, and things went on as normal. However, Bacon's rebellion had far-reaching results, not only for Virginia, but for the whole history of the South, and especially the slave system as it continued to develop. Because the rich white planters in Virginia were determined that the poor whites would never again be able to rise up against them. And so they looked for ways to get the poor whites in Virginia on their side. And they hit on a very clever method. Now, if you are, imagine for a minute you're the leader in a society, and you want to get all the citizens on the same page, or at least the majority of the citizens. You want to get them working together, more united, and so forth. What is the best way to do that? Well, if you think about it, really, the best way to do that is to find a common enemy. Someone that all those people that you're trying to unite can hate. So that they can all get on the same page, hating this common enemy, engaging in this common cause or common struggle. That really helps to build solidarity between people. And so the rich white planters had to find a common enemy to get the poor whites on their side. And of course, there was a potential common enemy present in the colony, namely African Americans, who were already on the road to lifelong hereditary slavery, and who, of course, looked different from the majority of the settlers, who came from a different culture, who were easily identifiable in most cases. Very convenient scapegoat that the rich whites in Virginia could use to promote white solidarity. And so the leaders in the House of Burgesses began to pass more and more racist laws, more and more anti-black legislation. For example, codifying that slavery was in fact a hereditary condition, that it was lifelong, restricting the freedom of movement of African Americans, and so forth. And they enlisted the poor whites to help them enforce those laws. For example, by staffing slave patrols to look for runaway slaves. Now, the poor whites in Virginia were so poor that they could not afford to own slaves. So why would they get behind the slave system and fall for this? What was in it for them? Well, the racist slave system as it emerged in Virginia and the South benefited poor whites by giving them a sense of prestige. It gave them a sense of status as white people. Because, most of the poor whites were very poor. They lived in shacks, their kids were barefoot, many of them were illiterate, had no education, and so forth. But in the slave system as it emerged, none of those things mattered. If you were white, you had a certain prestige just based on your race. And that idea of white solidarity, of white privilege, gave the poor whites a higher sense of self, and so forth. And in that sense, they felt that it was beneficial. And so throughout the history of the South, we see that many poor white people did support the slave system and segregation as it later emerged and so forth under Jim Crow. because of that prestige that whiteness itself conferred on them. And so, to finish up, we can say that Bacon's rebellion then had very far reaching consequences for whites and especially for African Americans throughout the South, and we'll explore that theme repeatedly as this course goes forward.